Texas has seen many things, but hidden behind quiet suburbs, shadowed railroads, and historic towers are stories few ever truly knew. These aren't just crimes, they're warnings. If you're drawn to true crime and unsolved mysteries told with quiet depth and haunting clarity, subscribe to Roadside Tales. Case 1. Dean Corll, the Candyman. Houston, Texas. Early 1970s. A growing city with new suburbs, warm evenings, and a sense of safety that made people leave their front doors unlocked. Parents let their children roam freely, trusting that danger was something you read about in faraway places. But within the quiet corners of that city, a man was doing something unthinkable, and he was doing it quietly for years. His name was Dean Corll. To neighbors, he was kind and mild-mannered. He worked at a family candy business, handed out sweets at local events, and often seemed to care about the neighborhood kids. People called him the Candyman. No one suspected that behind the smile was a predator. Between 1970 and 1973, at least 28 teenage boys disappeared from the Houston area. Some were reported missing, others weren't. Many were assumed to be runaways boys from troubled homes or with a rebellious streak. But in reality, they had all crossed paths with Corll. Corll didn't act alone. He manipulated two teenage boys, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, into helping him. They were young, impressionable, and came from unstable backgrounds. He offered them money freedom and what he claimed were important roles in a secretive operation. Over time, they realized they weren't helping people. They were helping Corll lead boys to a place they would never return from. The setup was deceptively ordinary. Henley or Brooks would lure another boy with offers of a party-free drugs or even a job. Once inside Corll's home, the atmosphere changed. Doors locked, lights dimmed, and what happened after that was never meant to be seen again. The boys were kept from leaving by force. Some were held for hours, some longer, but none were ever seen alive again. Corll had developed a chilling method. He used specific tools to ensure control. Once his victims were subdued, he took his time. Days sometimes passed before they were gone. When it was over, Corll wrapped the bodies in plastic sheeting and disposed of them quietly at a rented boat, shed under a tool shed, or buried along a desolate beach road. Despite this horrifying cycle, Corll remained invisible to the law. He moved frequently, kept a low profile, and never drew attention. Police had no reason to question him. The boys were simply missing. Their faces appeared on flyers, but no one could connect the disappearances to the man with the candy. That all changed on August 8, 1973. It started like so many other nights. Elmer Wayne Henley brought two teenagers, his friend Tim Curley, and a girl named Rhonda Williams, to Corll's house. Henley believed it would be another routine gathering, but Corll was angry. Furious, in fact. He had never allowed girls to be present. To him, this broke the rules. Later that night, all three teenagers were tied up. Corll said he planned to kill them. Henley pleaded. He said he would bring more boys if Corll let them go. Corll hesitated, then untied Henley, saying he could watch. But when Corll turned away, Henley made a decision that would end everything. He grabbed a pistol nearby and shot Corll 6 times. Dean Corll died on the floor of his own home. The terror he created ended in an instant. Police arrived at the scene expecting confusion. Instead, they found clarity in horror. The home contained suspicious items, plastic sheets, restraints, and more. Henley confessed everything. He didn't hold back. Over the next several days, he led officers to multiple burial sites. The most disturbing was a rented boat shed where bodies were stacked and buried in lime. One by one, the locations were unearthed. At a beach in Bolivar, under a tool shed, in the boat storage. The bodies kept appearing. 17, 21, 25, 28, each one wrapped, each one telling the same story of a life interrupted by something sinister. The discovery shocked Houston. Parents were horrified. Reporters descended on the city. Families wept as long-missing sons were finally found, but in the worst way imaginable. The question echoed, how did this go unnoticed for so long? Corll had chosen his victims carefully. Many had little adult supervision. Some had been in trouble before. Others simply trusted the wrong person. He picked boys few people expected to be missed quickly. He knew the system wouldn't respond fast, and he took advantage of that silence. Elmer Henley and David Brooks were both arrested and charged. Henley, the one who ended Corll's life, was sentenced to life in prison. His testimony provided the details that shocked the nation. Brooks, less cooperative, also received life. To this day, Henley remains in prison. He has granted interviews claimed he was manipulated and has occasionally shown remorse. But to many, no explanation could ever undo what was done. Dean Corll never stood trial. He left no confession, no written explanation, no apology. He died with his secrets, and the city of Houston was left to pick up the pieces. The neighborhoods where he once walked now carry a different kind of silence. The Candyman is no longer a name people say with nostalgia. It is a warning, a reminder that danger doesn't always wear a scowl. Sometimes it smiles, it offers sweets, it remembers your name, and it waits. Today the boat shed is gone. The old homes have been bulldozed. Nothing physical remains. But in the memories of families and in the records of Texas law enforcement, Dean Corll's crimes live on. A case study in deception, a lesson in looking deeper, and a tragedy that still echoes down empty streets where children once played. The story dominated national headlines for weeks. News vans camped outside the recovered crime scenes. Parents clutched old photos of their children, hoping for answers, fearing confirmation. The city of Houston held its breath each time a new grave was uncovered. Police officers, many of whom were parents themselves, described the work as the most harrowing of their careers. The emotional toll rippled far beyond the victims' families. Funerals were held almost daily for a time. Schools closed for memorials. Churches opened their doors for group counseling. The city's faith in its own safety had been shattered. And while the community mourned, investigators struggled with the sheer scope of the case. Cataloging evidence, matching remains to names, working against the limits of 1970s forensic science. Psychologists, criminologists, and reporters all asked the same question: why? Why did Dean Corll do what he did? Some pointed to his strict upbringing, others to a possible desire for control, but no clear motive ever emerged. In the end, what remained was not explanation, but devastation. The story became a defining moment in Houston's history. It changed the way police handled missing children cases. It altered how neighborhoods viewed trust. Parents began to question who they allowed into their homes. Community watch programs emerged. Schools started new education initiatives focused on safety and boundaries. In the decades since books have been written, documentaries filmed, Dean Corll's name appears alongside the worst of American serial killers, not because he was the most infamous, but because he hid in plain sight for years under the mask of someone people liked. Even now, some bodies remain unidentified. Some families still wonder. The memories are not just wounds, they are warnings. And for those who survived that era, the Candyman is not a nickname. It is a symbol of betrayal, a crack in the surface of suburban innocence, and a scar on a city that will never fully forget. If not for Elmer Henley's decision that night, Dean Corll might have continued. Another boy, another grave, another family left with questions, in a city that never suspected it was being hunted from within. Case dos. Angel Maturino Reséndiz, the railroad killer. In the late 1990s, whispers of an invisible killer traveled as silently as the freight trains that crisscrossed the American South. Murders were happening sudden, brutal, and often in towns linked only by the steel veins of the railway. No clear motive, no witnesses, and no pattern, except for one. Each crime scene was near train tracks. The man responsible was Angel Maturino Reséndiz, but to investigators, he became known as the Railroad Killer, a transient figure who slipped across borders and states with ease using freight trains as his personal highway. His name, his identity, and even his location changed constantly. But wherever he went, death often followed. Reséndiz was born in Puebla, Mexico in 1959. From a young age, he drifted crossing into the U.S. illegally, multiple times arrested, repeatedly deported again and again. But he always returned. He wasn't just fleeing poverty or chasing opportunity. Something deeper drove him, something darker. He had a long rap sheet of theft and burglary stretching back to the 1970s. But in the 1990s, the crimes changed. They became personal, violent. The railroad killer began selecting homes near rail lines, often isolated, often with few neighbors. He would break in, attack whoever was inside, and vanish into the night on foot or hopping the next freight car heading out. His methods were brutal, but rarely the same. Sometimes he used a blunt object, sometimes a firearm. In several cases, he used the victim's own possessions as weapons. He didn't carry tools of murder. He used what he found: a statue, a lamp, a pickaxe. To the investigators, this made him harder to profile. He wasn't driven by a single ritual. He was chaos wrapped in a man's frame. His victims were often asleep in their own homes. Most had no known enemies. Some were elderly. Some were young professionals. In many cases, Reséndiz stayed in the home after the killing, eating food, watching television, or sleeping in the victims' beds. Then he'd vanish, leaving behind a horrifying mystery and almost no trace. Authorities struggled to connect the crimes. They spanned across states: Texas, Kentucky, Illinois, Georgia, and more. Each police department treated their murders as isolated events. Only later did the FBI start to piece them together. The one common thread: proximity to train tracks. In December 1998, the case turned. Dr. Claudia Benton, a prominent pediatric neurologist, was found dead in her Houston area home. She had been attacked with a blunt object, then stabbed. Her home was near a railroad track. Her car was missing. But this time, the killer had left something behind: his fingerprints. They matched a man named Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez, one of many aliases used by Angel Maturino Reséndiz. Authorities finally had a name. But by the time they issued the alert, he was gone. He had already crossed the border again. The manhunt grew national. The FBI placed him on their 10 most wanted list. His face appeared on news programs and post office walls. But Reséndiz continued killing. In May 1999, he murdered Reverend Norman Cernick and his wife Karen in their Texas home. Again, the house was near train tracks. Again, there was no forced entry. Again, he disappeared. Panic began to spread across small towns with active train routes. People locked their doors at night. Rural sheriffs held town hall meetings. The image of a man stepping off a train in the middle of the night, unseen, untraceable, sent a chill through communities that had always felt safe. By June 1999, the number of known victims had risen to double digits. Journalists dubbed him a ghost on the rails. But behind the headlines was a man who seemed both cunning and disturbed. He believed his victims were sinners. In later interviews, he claimed he was doing the work of a higher power, that the killings were justified, righteous. But it was his family who ultimately ended the nightmare. His sister, deeply disturbed by his behavior and his claims of religious visions, contacted authorities. She agreed to help bring him in on one condition: that he would be surrendered peacefully and treated humanely. On July 13, 1999, Angel Maturino Reséndiz turned himself in at the International Bridge between El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. Texas Ranger Drew Carter was there to receive him. Reséndiz walked calmly into custody, surrounded by law enforcement, ending one of the most unnerving serial killer investigations in modern U.S. history. In custody, Reséndiz showed no remorse. He spoke softly, often referring to biblical justice. He believed his killings were acts of purification. Psychiatrists debated whether he was delusional or simply manipulative. His legal team attempted to argue mental incompetence, but the court ruled otherwise. In May 2006, Reséndiz was convicted of capital murder for the killing of Dr. Claudia Benton. At his sentencing, the courtroom was filled with victims' families. Some cried, some sat in silence. When asked if he had any last words before being executed, Reséndiz said, "I want to ask if it is in your heart to forgive me. You don't have to. I know I allowed the devil to rule my life." He was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas on June 27, 2006. At age 46, the railroad killer was gone. After his arrest, investigators revisited crime scenes from across several states. With Reséndiz in custody, new leads emerged in unsolved cases previously considered isolated. Cold case units began rechecking fingerprints, forensic materials, and train schedules. Although some crimes remained officially unlinked, many law enforcement officers believed Reséndiz's true body count was never fully uncovered. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was how easily he had crossed state and national borders. Despite being detained and deported by U.S. authorities multiple times throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Reséndiz always found his way back undetected, unregistered. It exposed significant flaws in immigration enforcement at the time, sparking heated public debates. Families of victims spoke to the press about the gaps in the system. They questioned how someone already on law enforcement's radar could vanish so completely between jurisdictions. Some lobbied for changes in how crimes near transportation hubs, especially trains, were handled. In a matter of months, the railroad killer had forced a rethinking of how mobility and crime intersect. For psychologists and criminologists, Reséndiz was a deeply unsettling subject. He didn't fit neatly into standard profiles. He wasn't driven by money. He didn't seek fame. His behavior was erratic, his planning inconsistent, and his reasons when spoken aloud seemed detached from reality. He called himself a messenger, claimed divine influence, yet many of his actions suggested calculated evasion. What struck many investigators most was the contrast between his quiet demeanor and the chaos he left behind. Interviews with people who had met him before the killings described him as soft-spoken, even polite. He didn't rant. He didn't threaten. He simply waited until the moment came. Then he acted. In some homes, he spent hours after the murders reading books, listening to music, using the kitchen. In one case, he was found to have rearranged items in the house before leaving, as if staging the room for someone else to find. These small, eerie details added an extra layer of psychological disturbance to an already terrifying pattern. Media coverage of the case dwindled after his execution, but in law enforcement circles, the case remains a touchpoint. Reséndiz became part of FBI training modules. His methods, especially his use of infrastructure to bypass typical patterns of detection, have been studied in criminal justice programs across the country. One retired Texas Ranger who worked the case said it best: he didn't just move between cities. He moved between world's sleepy towns and major hubs, backyards, and border crossings. He didn't leave footprints. He left questions. In the years that followed, more coordinated efforts emerged between rail companies, border patrol, and local authorities. Trains were fitted with better surveillance. Yard workers were trained to report unusual activity. Some communities along the southern railway lines installed cameras not to stop theft, but to catch people like him. There were no books in Reséndiz's cell, no visitors in his final weeks. His last meals were simple. He didn't request a final statement beyond his brief apology, and when the execution ended, there were no protests, no loud headlines, just quiet closure for a trail of pain that had stretched across a continent. But for the families of the dead, closure is a complicated word. Some never got full answers. Some never received their loved ones' remains. A few still question whether Reséndiz acted alone, whether he might have inspired others or copied methods he learned elsewhere. These questions remain unresolved. What's clear is that the story of the railroad killer endures not because of its numbers, but because of the way it made people feel: vulnerable, exposed, unsafe in their own homes. It wasn't just the violence, it was the silence before and after. The fact that someone could walk out of the darkness and vanish just as easily. The tracks he used are still active today. Trains still cut through towns he passed through. But to those who know the story, those tracks aren't just transportation routes. They're reminders that for a brief and terrifying period, someone turned them into pathways of terror. No engine, no horn, just footsteps in the gravel and a door left unlocked. Case 3. Charles Whitman, the Texas Tower Sniper. August 1st, 1966. A sweltering Monday morning in Austin, Texas. Students were walking between summer classes at the University of Texas. Families toured the campus. People ran errands downtown. It was the kind of day where no one looked up until the shots rang out. Charles Joseph Whitman, a 25-year-old former Marine and architecture student, had climbed to the top of the 307-foot clock tower in the center of campus. From the observation deck, he carried a small arsenal: rifles, shotguns, pistols, and over 700 rounds of ammunition. At 11:48 a.m., he began shooting. And for the next 96 minutes, chaos reigned. Before that moment, Whitman had spent the night writing a note. In it, he described feeling overwhelming anger and intrusive thoughts he could no longer control. He also mentioned severe headaches and a fear that something was deeply wrong with his mind. At 3 a.m., he murdered his mother in her apartment. Hours later, he killed his wife in their home while she slept. That morning, he packed weapons and supplies into a trunk. Dressed like a maintenance worker, he entered the university's main building and took an elevator up the tower. He then carried his gear up a flight of stairs, killed the receptionist who confronted him, and barricaded himself on the observation deck. There, with a view of the city and the campus below, he began firing. His targets were random, anyone walking outside: students, professors, children, people on bicycles. No one was safe. Some dropped instantly. Others crawled behind bushes, benches, or fountains. As the minutes passed, the gunfire didn't stop. There were no rules, no pattern, just sudden violence from above. Emergency services were slow to respond. Most had never trained for a scenario like this. Police officers used their own hunting rifles borrowed from local stores or citizens. Radio communications were fragmented. There was no SWAT team, no active shooter protocols, just panic and a desperate attempt to stop the man in the tower. Civilians joined in. Armed students and bystanders returned fire from behind cars and walls, hoping to pin Whitman down. For a brief moment, the university became a war zone. Bullet holes scarred statues and buildings. Ambulances raced in and out. Journalists ran toward the gunfire to capture history in real time. Eventually, 3 Austin police officers and a civilian made their way up the tower. After a tense climb and brief shootout, they cornered Whitman on the deck. At 1:24 p.m., Officer Houston McCoy fired the shot that ended it. Whitman was dead. But the damage had already been done. 16 people were killed that day. Over 30 were wounded. Some injuries were permanent. One victim, Claire Wilson, a pregnant student, was shot in the abdomen. She survived. Her unborn child did not. Another man died years later from complications related to his injuries, raising the death toll to 17. In the hours following the shooting, police searched Whitman's home and found detailed notes. He had written about his mental state. He described his obsession with violence. He even requested an autopsy to examine his brain. That autopsy later revealed a brain tumor, specifically a glioblastoma, pressing against the amygdala, a part of the brain linked to aggression and emotion regulation. The tumor sparked intense debate. Did it explain his actions? Was it a factor or an excuse? Doctors were divided. Some said it may have contributed to his impulse control. Others believed it was irrelevant. But the question never fully faded: what turns a man from a model student and Marine into a mass murderer? Charles Whitman's background complicated the story. He was an Eagle Scout, a scholarship student, and had served honorably in the Marines. He had no prior criminal record. Professors described him as intelligent if quiet. His friends knew he owned guns but never saw him as dangerous. He even sought help before the attack, visiting campus mental health services and a private physician. But his warnings weren't seen as urgent. The shooting changed the way America viewed public safety. It was one of the first mass shootings at a school in U.S. history, and certainly the first carried out from such a highly visible position. The clock tower itself became a symbol of horror. It was closed to the public for decades. For law enforcement, the attack became a case study. It exposed weaknesses in police coordination and emergency response. In the years that followed, departments across the country developed specialized tactics training and equipment to deal with active shooters. Many of those early frameworks can be traced back to what happened in Austin in 1966. For survivors and the families of victims, the trauma endured. Some avoided the campus entirely. Others spent years recovering from physical injuries and emotional wounds. Memorials were quietly held. Names were etched into plaques. But for a long time, the university and the country struggled with how to remember the event. It wasn't until 2016, on the 50th anniversary of the shooting, that the University of Texas installed a permanent memorial. Survivors' families and first responders gathered at the foot of the tower. Some spoke for the first time about what they had lived through. Others simply stood in silence, remembering the sound of gunfire echoing through the heat. The impact of Whitman's actions didn't end with the final gunshot. Investigators, medical professionals, and journalists spent years unpacking not just the event, but the man behind it. What they found was a portrait of internal conflict masked by surface-level success. Whitman had grown up in a deeply abusive household. His father, a domineering figure, ruled the family with violence and fear. Charles had excelled in academics and the military, but beneath that discipline was a young man shaped by control trauma and a desperate desire to be understood. His journals reflected a person both self-aware and unraveling. In one entry, he wrote about his inability to sleep, his compulsions, and a strange sense of emotional detachment. He noted that something in his head felt broken. He also documented how he had sought help multiple times, speaking with doctors, writing out his thoughts, even making lists of people he feared he might hurt. Yet, despite the signs, no intervention came. Mental health resources at the time were limited and often misunderstood, and even when he expressed concern over his own impulses, those around him failed to grasp the urgency. This failure, not just of one person but of a system, remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. After the shooting, many survivors reported lasting trauma. The randomness of the attack left people questioning the safety of everyday life. Some developed severe anxiety, depression, or post-traumatic stress. Others reported survivors' guilt. Why had they lived when someone standing next to them had not? The University of Texas Tower remained closed for decades. For many, it was too much of a symbol, a wound that stood above the city. Even after reopening, access was limited and watched. The observation deck, once a peaceful lookout, became a site of historical weight. The legacy of the attack also influenced architectural design. Some campuses reconsidered access to rooftops, tower structures, and high vantage points. New policies were drafted to secure public buildings more thoroughly. Emergency response drills were rewritten to include aerial threats. In the decades since, Charles Whitman's name has faded from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies. But to those who lived through August 1st, 1966, the silence after the final shot never truly ended. Survivors formed quiet communities. Some chose not to speak publicly for decades. Others became advocates for gun reform, mental health awareness, and trauma support. One retired officer who helped evacuate students that day later said, "We didn't even have a word for what happened. We just knew everything changed. That change is still unfolding. Policies, protocols, public awareness, all shaped in some way by the man who climbed the tower. The victims of that day included students on their way to class, tourists, taking photos, a newspaper reporter, and a young boy delivering newspapers. The randomness of the loss is what haunts so many. There was no target list, no manifesto, just a man who, for reasons still debated, decided to make the world stop moving for 96 minutes. In 2001, decades after the shooting, Claire Wilson, the pregnant student shot on the plaza, was one of the few survivors who returned to speak publicly. Her voice cracked as she described that morning. She recalled the sun, the sound of pigeons, and then the bullet that changed everything. She survived. Her child did not. Moments like that are why this story is still told. Not for the sake of the shooter, but for the people who didn't see it coming, for the city that still hears echoes when looking up at the tower, and for every place that hopes it never happens again, but now knows it might. Some stories end in justice. Others just stop. But the silence they leave behind never really fades. If these are the kinds of truths you don't want to miss, subscribe to Roadside Tales.